Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation. The mission of the Future of Freedom Foundation is to present an uncompromising case for the libertarian philosophy. And as part of that case, we have taken an ardent stance from our very inception in 1989 against the federal government's war on drugs. And as part of that position, we are putting together a special video series featuring prominent people in the libertarian movement as well as some non-libertarians, explaining to people why it is so important that we bring an end to this federal governmental program, as well as on a state level as well. And one of my guests today to talk about that issue is Laurence Vance. Laurence has been policy advisor here at the Future of Freedom Foundation for so many years, and he is a well-read writer. He's written on all sorts of publications, the Foundation for Economic Education, the Ludwig von Mises Institute, and many, many others. He has several books, all of which I recommend that he's written. They can all be found at vancepublications.com. And one of the best books he's ever written is on the subject at hand. The War on Drugs is a War on Freedom. Now, we often hear about that, Laurence, that the war on drugs really is a war on freedom. Would you explain, though, what it is that you mean by that concept?
Well, although the drug war it's certainly unconstitutional, it's an illegitimate function of government, it's a total failure, it's the cause of a great many evils, but we should never lose sight of the fact that above all, the real problem is that it is a war on individual liberty, private property, personal responsibility, and free markets. The most basic natural right that men have is control over their own bodies. Every man has a natural right to consume or take into his body anything he wants for any reason, whether that entails eating, drinking, smoking, injecting, or snorting, whether that's because what he takes in his body nourishes him, medicates him, or just simply makes him feel good. Now, a close second to this is the natural right to do as you see fit with your property. Whether you want to possess the property, consume the property, trade it, give it away, if you can't do what you want with your own body and your own property, you don't live in a free society. You live in a totalitarian society. So a defense of the war on drugs is really just a defense of an abusive, intrusive, authoritarian nanny-state government. Everyone should have the natural right to do anything that's peaceful, as long as he's not aggressing against someone else's personal property.
Okay, so what do you say to people when they say, let's say a mother's got some small children, 8 or 9 years old, or teenagers, and they see the drug scourge across America. They see young people ingesting substances that arguably are harmful to them, and they say to you, look, Laurence, drugs are really harmful. What's wrong with the government stepping in and preventing people from doing things that are really harmful to themselves and to society?
Well, first of all, it's the parent's responsibility to protect and provide for the safety and welfare of the child, not the government. Unless, Hillary Clinton's in charge, that's what she would love to do. But it's the parent's responsibility, and it's the same thing with other harmful substances like alcohol, which can be argued is even more dangerous than drugs, and maybe bad music or bad literature. There's any number of bad and harmful things that can affect the child, and it's up to the parents, not the government, to protect that child and raise that child and protect the child from bad influences. Where do you draw the line? Once you say the government should protect your child from drugs, well, why not the government protect your child from bad literature and ban books at the library? Why doesn't the government ban large sugary drinks like they tried to do in New York City, where you couldn't buy a soft drink at 7-Eleven that was over a certain number of ounces? So where do you draw the line? Once you allow the government to get a foothold to protect your children, there's no reasonable or logical argument that you can make against the government protecting your child from anything.
All right, so define to me, summarize to me what you mean when you say a free society. You as a libertarian, what does the term free society mean to you then?
A free society means that property rights are respected, that people are not charged with victimless crimes. Every crime has to have a victim. As long as someone is peaceful and consensual and voluntary in his actions and interactions with others and businesses, he should be left alone by the government. He should be free to pursue his own interests, his own happiness, engage in the commerce he chooses to engage in, partake of any substance he chooses to partake of. That's a free society.
All right, and so what should government be doing then in that society?
The only legitimate purpose of a government in a free society is to prosecute and punish those who violate the personal and property rights of others. If you're not violating the personal or property rights of others, the government has no business telling you what to do, monitoring your activities, reading your emails, spying on you, preventing you from buying drugs or buying any other substance. You should be able to do anything that's peaceful without government interference.
And by aggression, you mean what? Like violating the rights of others? Give me an example.
Doing physical violence to someone, stealing their property, trespassing on their property, obviously, raping, shooting, stabbing, things like that.
Okay, that's an excellent summation of what the libertarian paradigm is with respect to freedom. And obviously, the war on drugs provides a perfect model of understanding how libertarians feel about freedom. Let's get into the collateral consequences of the war on drugs. You mentioned that this is an attack on the Constitution. What do you mean by that?
Well, the Constitution nowhere authorizes the federal government to have anything to do with drugs. Now, you don't have to be a libertarian to recognize that the drug war is incompatible with limited government under the Constitution. We all know what James Madison said in Federalist 45. The powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. Those which are to be remain in the states are numerous powers. So nowhere does the Constitution authorize the federal government to intrude itself into the personal eating, drinking, or smoking habits of any American. Nowhere does the Constitution authorize the federal government to regulate or criminalize or prohibit the manufacture of any drug or the use of any drug. Nowhere does the Constitution authorize the federal government to restrict or monitor any kind of harmful substance or a mood-altering substance that any American wants to eat or drink or snort or smoke or inject or whatever. Nowhere does the Constitution authorize the federal government to concern itself with anything that any American wants to consume. And actually, the Constitution doesn't authorize the federal government to ban any substance whatsoever. If cocaine and heroin were the most dangerous substances known to man, the federal government would still have no authority to ban those substances. not any more than they had the authority to ban baseball, hot dogs, and apple pie. So the war on drugs is absolutely unconstitutional in every way. And what is surprising is that conservatives who say they revere the Constitution, they say they follow the Constitution, yet they are the most ardent drug warriors. But nowhere in the Constitution can they point to a place where the Constitution authorizes the federal government to have anything to do with drugs, marijuana or any drug whatsoever.
Yeah, isn't it interesting that with prohibition, that there was an acknowledgement of the principle that you're enunciating? That is, that when they wanted to pass laws criminalizing the possession or distribution of alcohol, they had to get a constitutional amendment saying the federal government now has the authority to do this. They never did that with drugs.
I've written a whole article on this. The 18th Amendment was proposed back around 1917. Then it was ratified by the states the next year. Then it became effective the next year. And the 18th Amendment prohibited the manufacture, sale, and transportation of intoxicating liquor, not the drinking of it. All right? So it's a little different than the drug war. But the 21st Amendment repealed the 18th Amendment. So these progressives and these people that wanted the federal government to outlaw alcohol, they realized the government had no authority to do this. That's why they had to get the 18th Amendment to the Constitution passed in order for the government to go after alcohol. Now, modern-day drug warriors have no concern whatsoever for the Constitution. These conservatives who claim to revere the Constitution, they are enemies of the Constitution because they don't follow it whatsoever when it comes to certain issues like the drug war. So prohibition and the drug war, they both resulted in violence. They both corrupted law enforcement. They both made otherwise law-abiding Americans into criminals. But there are some major differences. Prohibition was constitutional, as bad as it was. Just because something's constitutional doesn't mean it's necessarily a good thing, right? Like the income tax, okay? But the war on drugs is so much worse than prohibition because it's not constitutional at all, and it's resulted in much more damage and much more billions of dollars wasted.
All right, you mentioned corruption. What do you mean by that?
Well, the war on drugs corrupts law enforcement officers because of all the money that's involved. It allows, you have these asset forfeiture laws where the police can seize your money, seize your car, seize your property if you're caught with drugs. So thanks to the war on drugs and these asset forfeiture laws, police can practice what's called policing for profit. This is where they confiscate cash from law-abiding Americans because if you have a large sum of money on you, well, you must be a drug dealer. That's where you got that money, or that's, you're going to go buy drugs with it, or you just sold drugs and got the money. So the war on drugs has corrupted law enforcement at all levels.
All right. Yeah, I just saw an article just this morning that said that 2 cops in California were charged with seizing some of their ill-gotten drugs and going out in the market and selling them. So you're right. I mean, it sucks in a lot of people, and you alluded to that when you said that it attracts otherwise law-abiding citizens into this trade. How does that happen? Give me the process by which what you're talking about there.
Well, you can have a typical American who's never broken a law, maybe never even gotten a speeding ticket, but if he wants to have a pot plant in his house because it looks good, well, all of a sudden he's a criminal and he's subject to arrest, and he's perfectly law-abiding in every way, never hurt anyone, and now his life is ruined. He has an arrest record. This is going to affect his employment. It's going to affect his family. It's going to affect him financially. So the war on drugs affects so many people in so many different ways. It is just such a horrendous thing. And the supposed benefits of the war on drugs are not worth the cost, which, by the way, the last time I checked was over $40 billion a year on the federal, state, and local level to fight this war on drugs.
Yeah, I can't imagine a government program that's a bigger failure. Are there any redeeming aspects to this war? I mean, what arguments do the drug warriors have left, do you think?
There are no redeeming arguments. The war on drugs is a failure in every way. And it's destroyed financial privacy. It clogs the judicial system with non-crimes. It swells the prison populations with non-violent offenders. It fosters violence. It takes finite law enforcement resources away from fighting real crime. It militarizes the local police. They have these ridiculous sting operations. The war on drugs has hindered legitimate pain management. It's made doctors into criminals because the government says they shouldn't be prescribing so many drugs. So there's so many adverse consequences from the war on drugs. It's a complete failure. It hasn't prevented anyone from overdosing on drugs. It's failed to reduce drug use. It can't keep drugs out of prisons. They still get drugs in prison that are smuggled in. The war on drugs hasn't stopped the demand for drugs. It's failed to keep drugs out of the hands of children and drug addicts. It's failed to keep drugs out of school. It's failed in every way. It's failed to stop the flow of drugs in the United States. It's a complete failure. And it just boggles my mind that this thing still continues. Of course, there's money in it. There's money in it for law enforcement. There's money in it for prisons. You have all these private prisons that are built to house offenders. If you got rid of the drug war, you could close half the prisons and lay off half the police, in my opinion.
Yeah, well, you'd also end up with federal judges that would have nothing to do because a large portion of their dockets are based on drug cases. And of course, their law clerks and the court clerks would have nothing to do. So, yeah, there's a huge bureaucracy that's formed that I think has a vested interest in keeping this war going, not just the corrupt aspects like the bribes and the payoffs and the asset forfeiture, but also the salary structure of people that are dependent on it. I think the last two groups that are going to end up favoring the war on drugs are the drug dealers and the drug cartels and the drug gangs and the drug war bureaucracy. Talk a little bit about the violence that the war on drugs has brought to America as well as other countries like in Latin America.
Well, we've all heard the reports from Mexico, how the police can't even go into certain areas because the drug cartels control everything. And some American cities, inner cities, have turned into war zones with rival gangs, and drugs is a way for these gangs to make money. If you got rid of the federal prohibition on victimless crimes, drugs, prostitution, gambling, and things like that, these gangs wouldn't have anything to do. It's the federal government that enables these gangs. And the violence is a direct result of this drug war. And we've heard different reports about Mexico, how they're going to legalize, marijuana, but they just need to have drug freedom. All drugs legal, not just marijuana, and that would put these drug cartels out of business overnight if they would just legalize drugs. And the United States should do the same thing. The demand for drugs is in the United States. We're the problem. These smugglers want to bring drugs into the U.S. because the demand is here. We need to have drug freedom.
Now, what do you say to people that say, look, if you legalize drugs, you're sending out a message that that it's okay to engage in drugs and ingest drugs and engage in things that are harmful, and that why do we as a society want to send out a message like that?
Well, pornography is legal. Are we sending a message that pornography is a good thing and everyone should be reading pornography? Well, of course not. Alcohol is legal. Does that mean we're sending a message that alcohol is a great thing and everybody should just be drinking? Of course not. So these are ridiculous arguments that people bring up. Now, I don't use drugs myself. I don't recommend that anyone use drugs. I don't hang around people that use drugs. So just because I want a free society with drug freedom doesn't mean I think using drugs is a good thing or it's a moral thing or that it's something I recommend. So people are twisting our arguments when they say things like, well, you just don't care if people die from drug overdoses, and you don't care if people use drugs. We do care. We are concerned about it. But we don't think it's the business of government. We think it's the job of individuals and families and churches and nonprofit organizations, social welfare organizations. It's their job to handle drug problems, just like they handle alcohol problems right now. There's absolutely no difference. There shouldn't be any difference in the way the government treats alcohol or drugs.
Well, and you see some of the politicians, when their kids get into trouble, they somehow or another are able to secure favorable deals that get their kids into rehab and counseling, as compared to people in the lower echelons that end up spending 20 or 30 years of their lives in jail. Talk about a little bit about the mandatory minimum sentences and what that has done to ravage people in America, especially those that are black or Hispanics.
Well, the government has the mandatory minimums. So if you get caught with drugs, I guess it's the third time, and it can be just a very minor drug infraction. And yet, because you have two other offenses, you can go to jail for life. There are people serving life in prison for drug possession. There are about, right now, 135,000 men and women behind bars in the United States for drug possession. And there's about 48, 49, 50,000 people in state prisons. And then you have like 90,000 people in local jails. And this results in crippling debt that people get into. They're separated from their family. They lose their job. They have a criminal record. They're not able to get housing or public assistance. So the mandatory minimums absolutely ruin people's lives. No one should go to jail for even a day for possessing or using any drug. There shouldn't be a sentence period for any kind of drug use or drug possession.
All right. You talked about legalizing all drugs, and as you know, there are movements afoot at the state level to legalize marijuana. I think 3 or 4 states have legalized it totally, and others have legalized it for medical marijuana, and now there's several on the ballot in November that call for legalization of marijuana. What's your perspective on that? Should it only be marijuana that should be legalized, or should it be all drugs, as you alluded to earlier?
Well, it's got to be all drugs. Now, 24 states have legalized medical marijuana. And then I think 18 or so states have decriminalized the possession of marijuana in small amounts, okay? And 4 states have legal recreational use of marijuana. But most Americans who support these changes in marijuana laws, they generally don't support the freedom to use any drug. Even the Libertarian Party candidate for president, Gary Johnson, he doesn't extend drug freedom beyond marijuana. But all drugs drugs, in a libertarian perspective, should be legal. There should be absolute drug freedom. The libertarian argument is a philosophical one. It has nothing to do with how potent a particular drug is, whether a drug is more addictive than another drug, or whether a drug is more harmful than another drug. The libertarian position has nothing to do with whether marijuana is good for medical purposes or whether another drug can be used for medical purposes. That's not the issue. The libertarian argument has nothing to do with how we classify drugs. You know, the government has this schedule where they classify drugs, and there's different sentences for each drug you possess that you're caught with. So the libertarian position is simply that all drugs should be legal. It's a simple position. It's a consistent position. It's not the business of government to prohibit, restrict, license, or regulate, or control what any American wants to eat, drink, or smoke, or inject in his body. So there shouldn't be any laws whatsoever on any level, federal, state, or local, any laws regarding the buying, selling, possessing, using, processing, manufacturing, or trafficking in drugs. The consistent position, the libertarian position, is that all drugs should be legalized, the DEA should be abolished, the war on drugs should be ended, anyone in prison for a drug crime only should be released immediately. That is the libertarian position. It is consistent, it is simple, there's no exceptions to it, that's it.
Well, and wasn't that the American position for much of American history?
Oh, certainly. Up until the early 1900s, there were absolutely no laws in the United States on the federal level regarding drug prohibition. You could buy medicine that had cocaine in it. And the government started in the early 1900s, and then this simply escalated. And now we have the war on drugs that's been going on over 40 years, declared by President Richard Nixon. And we have this huge bureaucracy, the DEA, which is on the federal level and all the state levels. So, yes, at one time, we had absolute drug freedom in the United States. Now, during that period, did every American use drugs? No. Did Americans walk around stoned all over the place? No, not at all. Certain people use drugs, and they would use them whether they were legal or illegal, just like now. If people want to use drugs, they're going to use drugs. They don't care if it's illegal or not. So we did have a free society before 1900, not just regarding drugs, but regarding most every facet of American life. No income tax, no Social Security, no welfare, no Medicaid, Medicare, none of these programs. So we need to return to the free society that we used to have in the United States.
Laurence, let's wrap up by talking a little bit about what's going on in the Philippines. Give me your perspectives on what President Duterte is doing there with respect to his war on drugs.
Well, it's just like in Mexico or the United States. Certain elements of the population, they love it when the government says we're for law and order and we're going to crack down on the drug trade because that's the cause of these problems. The real cause of the problems is the drug prohibition instituted by the government. Drug freedom would solve the problem with the violence and the cartels, and you wouldn't have to have these extreme measures by governments to fight the drug war. It's not the fight the government should be fighting.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Laurence, for coming on and sharing these great perspectives on the drug war. We're very appreciative.
Thanks for having me, Jacob.